Bottom line is that the way I see the modern zoo is that it's more for the human visitor than it is for the animals. And as long as it's created that way and run that way, it's not going to be a humane enterprise. And so we really have to, I think, break the entire zoo mold and start over again. What I could see is that zoos eventually evolve into sanctuaries where they're not breeding animals, they're not importing them from the wild, but they're actually serving as rescue facilities so that when someone is caught with tigers in their backyard and they're confiscated, they have a place to put that animal that can better attend to their needs than what they had before. Or if a bear cub, for example, is orphaned in the wild, there's a place for that animal to go when that is the most humane alternative.
Tell me about Born Free's position on the tiger problem here in the United States.
Well, it feeds right into everything I've been talking about in terms of keeping wildlife in the wild. I mean, obviously, when people are keeping tigers in captivity, these are apex predators, and you can't sort of breed that or take that out of the animal. So no matter what construct you put a tiger into, when that tiger is in captivity, and more importantly, when that tiger is in captivity around humans, it's a recipe for disaster. Yeah. And so part of our situation is trying to keep them protected in the wild, but also out of human hands here in the United States. And so we fight against the exotic pet trade, where people have tigers in their backyards, their apartments, their living rooms, literally, because we know the human interactions that causes and the fatalities and other injuries that come as a result.
I'm a lawyer, and I happen to know that what animals are kept in somebody's home or in their yard is a matter of state law. It does seem incredulous that somebody would think it would be okay to keep a tiger in their backyard. But I understand that that's a great problem here in the United States, that in certain states that have no regulations to prohibit it, people keep tigers as pets.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, it's popularly thought, but we think it's fairly certain that there are more tigers in captivity in human hands in the United States than there are left in the wild, which for us is an alarming statistic to think about. You know, when you have maybe 3,000 tigers left in the wild where they belong, it really is alarming and concerning for us. And the other problem is that some states are particularly problematic, and in fact, Texas, where there's a proliferation of tigers in captivity, there may be more tigers in captivity in Texas than there are in India, which is the one remaining stronghold of the wild population of tigers. So it really is incongruous to me how A, people could want to keep these dangerous animals, and B, that states would allow these animals to be kept.
The why of that. Why would you want a tiger in your backyard kept in a little tiny enclosure? Why would you want to do that?
Well, I think I can kind of understand that part of it, and it goes like this. Either it's because you want to have the biggest, baddest animal on the block, and it used to be the Doberman, and then it was the Rottweiler, and now it's the lion cub or the tiger cub, and that eventually grows into a pretty large and domineering animal. But on the other hand, as a parent, I can sort of understand too, when you see a cub, a tiger cub, that is a cute and cuddly animal. It is incredibly affable, gregarious, playful. The problem is that when the person acquires that animal, they don't realize that eventually that animal is going to become a 300, 400-pound monster.
Yeah, right.
And then it becomes dangerous. And that's where you have animals that are either released into the wild of this country so that they're roaming around the streets of Birmingham, or they end up being the Humane Society's problem, or dumped on a local facility, or they're taken out into public on a leash and actually bite people. So that's really where the problem comes in. So I can see the desire to acquire the animal, that for some people, unlike me, there's not the separation there where they say, okay, that's a cute animal, but I wouldn't want to own one or have my child around one. And for some people, that leap doesn't ever get bridged.
Yeah. A few years back, maybe a half a dozen at this point, I remember reading in the New York Times about the tiger that was in an apartment in Harlem, I think it was. And, you know, the rescue officers had to come down the skyscraper and go through the window to try to sedate the tiger to get it out of the apartment building. How does a tiger end up in a public housing apartment building in New York City? Is it because it was purchased legally somewhere and then transported here illegally?
Yeah, it could be acquired in any number of ways. It could be legally acquired or illegally acquired. Obviously, it depends on the state where the problem is happening. And when you have a situation where, you know, in Connecticut, it's illegal to own a tiger, but in Pennsylvania, you can get a permit to own one, it's very easy with that patchwork of state laws to acquire the animals and move them around in interstate commerce. And so people get these animals and they get them in their houses. And I, for one, if I was the super of that building, wouldn't want to go tell that guy that he has to get rid of the tiger. I think he also had some big reptiles, like an alligator in his bathtub.
Yeah, I think that's right now that you say that,
so
sure.
I'd be a little fearful about going into that apartment, and I think that's what people prey on.
Another problem with respect to tigers, and particularly tiger cubs that grow into tigers, is this pay-for-play notion at the local malls, where in certain states, I guess, exhibitors bring tiger cubs in during a period where the tiger cub is 8 to 12 weeks old. You can go play with it or have your picture taken, and it's a big money maker for the exhibitor. Could you comment on that and how much that contributes to the breeding and the problem with tigers here in this country?
Yeah, well, as long as there's going to be profit made by showing those animals to the public, allowing the public to interact with those animals and take pictures with those animals, there's going to be a problem with those animals long term. First, it feeds the breeding, because obviously when there's profit to be made, there are people who are going to want that money, and greed takes over. You're going to breed the animals and try and display them to make the buck. But then what happens when the animals are too old to show? Well, they either get shipped off to some substandard facility where their lifestyle is horrible and they're inhumanely treated, or they're killed for their parts. And we have evidence that the meat of these tigers ends up in the trade, in the meat trade, exotic meat trade, or the animals end up, as we've talked about, in somebody's backyard as a pet. So it really does feed the problem to allow these animals to be shown to the public. And of course, in some situations, you have animals that are older being showed in the public, that are more grown up. And there was one instance in the Midwest where somebody was killed. A teenage girl was killed by an animal during a photo op. So you think that having an animal like a tiger on a leash is somehow going to be okay, but obviously it's just not.
Let's talk a little bit about the international trade of tiger parts, the problem of some of the folklore of the Chinese believing that tiger bones put in medicine or stews or whatever they're used in is something that I would imagine Born Free is up against.
Yeah, that's right. It is a huge problem. The international trade in tiger parts, much like the international trade in elephant ivory or rhino horn or bear gallbladder, hugely profitable on the black market. And while the international community does not allow legally the movement of tiger parts, it's illegal to trade internationally in these parts, the profit that can be made by the illegal trade is pretty enormous. And so you have tiger penis, tiger bone wine, tiger skins, claws, teeth, everything having a market value on the black market.
Yeah.
Now, two of the problems that comes from that relate to the source of these animals. On the one hand, you have businessmen in China who are quote-unquote farming these tigers, keeping them in these breeding facilities, and spending thousands and thousands of dollars to maintain the animals every year. And so naturally, they're putting pressure on the government, who in turn puts pressure on the international community to open up the legal trade so that those businessmen can finally see some profit on their investment. But as long as that's happening, as long as there's pressure and there's a black market for these items, there are poachers who are paying $1 for a bullet and taking the animals from the wild to feed into the trade. So really, as long as that international trade happens and there's not a firm message from all governments around the world, including China, that it shouldn't be happening, tigers are going to be vulnerable in the wild.
Is there anything our viewers can do to help with getting a message out there that this is not acceptable?
Yeah, well, really, it would help for them to contact us at Born Free so that we can take that message forward when we go to these international treaty meetings. It's called the Convention on International Trade and Endangered Species, and there are 175 or 176 countries that participate, including the United States, and we need to be able to tell the international community, including the United States government, that our citizens are strongly against any trade in tiger parts, but then also writing to the government itself, write to the Department of the Interior and let them know that we need the strongest possible regulations globally to prevent any tigers from being killed for the trade.
Last question, Tony the tiger. How heart-wrenching is that? Tony's living in a cage at a truck stop. Is this going to end for Tony, do you think?
Well, I think it will, and I'll tell you, you describe it as heart-wrenching, and it is, but it's also inspiring, because that was one situation where I personally, I have to admit, I'm guilty of this. I looked at that situation for many years, and I could not find a way out. I couldn't find a solution. I couldn't figure out how we can get this tiger out of this parish in Louisiana, where obviously the people who were entrenched there in the decision-making had no interest in doing so. And our friends at the Animal Legal Defense Fund had a great campaign and a successful campaign. And now the question is, come the end of the year, if his permit is in fact not able to be renewed, what's going to happen to Tony? And quite frankly, we've offered, if his health is strong enough, to take him to our sanctuary in India. Now, I know that's a big if, but God knows that would be an amazing end for that tragic story. But even if we got him to one of the sanctuaries like Big Cat Rescue in the U.S., it would still be just so wonderful for Tony.
That's just where I was going. I was going to ask, is there any possibility you could take Tony if things work out to India?
Absolutely.
Or certainly Big Cat Rescue would be another great organization.
Yeah, we have to make that judgment call. Is he healthy enough to make that trip? But if he is, absolutely, and he could actually be back where tigers belong.
The International Fund for Animal Welfare, known as IFAW, is currently one of the largest animal welfare and conservation charities in the world. Their mission is to improve the welfare of wild and domestic animals throughout the world by reducing commercial exploitation of animals, protecting wildlife habitats, and assisting animals in distress. Grace G. Gabriel is the Regional Director of International Fund for Animal Welfare Asia. She joined the International Fund for Animal Welfare in 1997 as the China Country Director. In this capacity, she established the IFAW China office. She initiated and managed an array of conservation and animal welfare campaigns and programs. Headed by Grace, IFAW China works with the Chinese government to influence its current conservation policies, increase coordination with the international community, and enhance enforcement of both domestic and international wildlife protection legislation.
Well, wild tiger only exists in Asia. It's an Asian species, and scientists believe that tiger as a species originated from China.
Really?
Yes. So a century ago, there were probably 100,000 tigers across Asian continent, as far wide to even to Iran, to the Caspian Sea.
Wow.
But in the past century, 3 subspecies of tigers have become extinct, including Caspian tiger, Bali, and Javan tiger subspecies. And in China, there is one subspecies of tiger called South China tiger subspecies, but this species hasn't been seen in the wild for over 30 years. So scientists believe that this species has already become extinct, except some individuals that are remaining in zoos. But China, even though, up until 1980s, China still had a policy of killing tigers as pests. And not until 1989, when China issued Wildlife Protection Act, when tiger killing was banned. And today, China had fewer than 30 tigers in the wild.
No, oh,
and,
wow.
And across tiger continent,
Wow.
there could be as few as 3,200 tigers across the continent in 13 tiger range states. But China is still very important for wild tiger conservation, because in China's border with Russia, there is a subspecies that's Amur tiger, which most of it live in Russia, in the Russian Far East. And it was in the past 50 years, that species had increased to about 450 individuals. But today, that species is also threatened because of the demand for tiger parts in China. And in southern China, in China's border with Myanmar and Vietnam, and that region, there is also the Indo-Chinese subspecies of tiger.